Good evening, my little freaksters. Right here on our big screen Philco, live from Nashville, Tennessee, we have the physician of fright himself, Dr. Gangrene. So stay tuned. This is Count Jimby's Late Night Freaky Freak Show.
Here comes Jimby, here comes the Jimby Show. Here comes Jimby, here comes the Jimby Show. Who's the man you heard about? Who's the one that'll shut your mouth? Who's the man that's in the house? Count Jimby. Who's the count with the freaky show? Who's the vampire with all the hoes? Who's the bald noodle bad and bold? Count Jimby. It's freaky, freaky. Shut your mouth. Here comes Jimmy. He's in the house. Here comes Jimmy. Hide your bitches. 'Cause here comes Jimby. Sit down and watch. This is the freaky, 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 freak show. Here comes Jimmy. Here comes the Jimmy Show.
Shackle Island doesn't appear on any maps or navigational charts. People claim it is a myth, a place mentioned in whispers to frighten children. Years ago, a medical madman was driven from civilization because of his love of monsters and horror. He set up an underground laboratory and broadcast station on Shackle Island. His name is Dr. Gangrene, and he calls this ongoing and mad experiment Chiller Cinema.
The doctor will see you now.
Hello, this is Dr. Gangrene, physician of fright, Nashville TV horror movie host.
Hey Doc, it's great having you on the show tonight. So Doc, there in Nashville, is there anyone special that inspired you to be the award-winning horror host that you are today?
Well, in Nashville in the 70s and again in the 80s, we had a horror host named Sir Cecil Creep. I actually got to meet him once when I was a kid, and I guess that was one of my inspirations. Another one of my big inspirations would be Alice Cooper, of all things. He's one of the guys that when I first discovered him, it just kind of blew my mind. I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. Sort of always thought of my show as sort of a cross between him and Vincent Price, who is another one of my major inspirations, particularly his part in House on Haunted Hill and Gilligan's Island. That's kind of what I was going for. It was always kind of meant to be light and fun and kid-like, but at the same time, you know, definitely having a good time with it and trying to keep it traditional, very traditional. Wanted to do something like the horror host shows of old.
Are there any other horror hosts that stand out to you?
Rich Coe's Svengoolie is about the best that there is in the business right now. I mean, he's professional. He's got his show on MeTV and it's broadcast nationally. Penny Dreadful is a good friend of mine up in the Massachusetts area. She does a really good show too. Of course, Elvira, you know, you gotta love Elvira, and Joe Bob Briggs. Those are really, and Count Gordeval. I mean, you look at the Rondo Awards, which is an annual award for horror excellence. They have a horror host category, and the people that have won it have been Rich Coe's Svengoolie, Penny Dreadful, and Count Gore, and Elvira. And really, you couldn't get a better crop of horror hosts than that, to tell the truth.
That is correct.
For our audience out there, how about giving us a little insight into what horror hosting actually is? Not that I'll be taking any notes or anything.
Well, I really like the way Rich Coe's Svengoolie, I really like the way he refers to himself as a horror movie host. That kind of explains it. When people say a horror host, you know, kind of raise the eyebrow, what is that? But if you say a horror movie host, well, that sort of explains it. It's a host who introduces horror movies. And that's exactly what it is. It's sort of a guide to introduce the film that's coming, kind of make it fun. He'll come back, he or she will come back in between the breaks and sort of do fun little things to kind of keep the ball rolling. You know, it all goes back to the 1950s when the Universal films first became available to the public. Universal, all their great horror movies, Dracula, Frankenstein, you know, Bride of Frankenstein, all that stuff, they made it available to television because previously it wasn't. But they made it available, and they encouraged each station to have a host who would dress up in a silly costume like this and introduce the film and make it fun for audiences, just as a way of building local, and that's what the horror host is about local entertainment. And originally intended, it was usually someone like a weatherman or a news channel person who would throw on a Dracula cape and talk in a silly accent and introduce the movies.
So Doc, tell us how Dr. Gangrene got started.
His origin, I did write up a history of him when I first started this thing. He was he was a mad medico, a doctor, a physician of fright who worked in Transylvania, set up a practice in the hills, and would treat anybody that came to him, monsters or humans alike. And once the monster community found out, they all started coming to him. They would have werewolves with a thorn stuck in their paw, or a vampire with a bad garlic burn. Things like that would come to get treatment from Dr. Gangrene. So he would fix them up. Well, once, of course, the humans found out about this, they weren't too happy about it and formed an angry mob, as they always do, and chased the doctor out of town. So now he's set up a secret laboratory on the mysterious Shackle Island and broadcasts his television show from there and continues his medical practice. That's a brief history of the doc.
So Doc, as a medical professional, tell us a little bit about the move from the operating table to public access television.
Well, that's kind of interesting. Before I was doing the TV show, I was writing and drawing comic books and ran my own comic book company called, originally Out of the Cellar Comics, and then we later changed the name to Volunteer Comics. It was pretty much a two-man show with myself and a friend of mine named Chuck Angel. Chuck and I ran that during the 90s, early 90s for, 5 or 6 years, and published a handful of comics, 5, 6, 7 comics. Did pretty well. We made enough money to break even on everything, made a little money on some. Never really, we raised money for the first comic book by selling 100 t-shirts for $10 a piece, raised $1,000, took that money, made the first comic book, used the sales from it, rolled into the second one, and so on, kept it going. Well, anyway, after a while, we were both burned out because it's so much work doing a comic book. You write, you draw, you ink it, the scripting, everything, it takes hours and hours sitting at the table, and I had a newborn baby who was born in 9/11/97. Okay, born in 1997. Had to stop and think for a second there, getting old. In 1997, when my new baby was born, is when we quit because I just didn't have time to do it anymore. So we took a break for a couple of years, and then in 1999 we moved. We came here to Hendersonville, Tennessee. I met a guy named Jack Wood, who turns out lived just a couple blocks away, who had this crazy cable access show called The Static Show, where he played this kind of hillbilly, I guess it's sort of like a hillbilly Pee Wee Herman character, you would call it. And he kind of talked me into doing a show, or I was asking him a lot of questions. He said, Larry, I think you should do this. I think you'd be good. So I called up Chuck and said, hey, I know what we're doing next. And he goes, what's that? I said, a cable access show. And he was like, what? So I kind of explained to him what I had in mind. And from the get-go, I just wanted to do a horror host show. I wanted to do a show where I would host horror movies. Now, when I started on cable access, I could only get a 30-minute time slot. So instead of doing a show showing horror movies, we did a show about horror movies. So we would talk about movies, show clips, show trailers, show music videos, go around town and visit haunted areas in the Nashville community, like Death Valley Haunted Woods or the Bell Witch Cave, which is not far from here. Just anything that had a horror tie-in. And that's how it started.
Here comes Jimmy.